Welcome to the sinister side, where dark stories and hidden truths come to light. Before we begin, tell us in the comments which country you're watching from and what time of day it is for you. Now, let's uncover the sinister side. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a chilling story. In the year 1850, Charleston, South Carolina stood as a city of elegance built on cruelty. From the harbor, its skyline looked proud and orderly, church steeples rising above tiled roofs, wide verandas draped in shade, horse-drawn carriages moving slowly through streets warmed by the coastal sun. But wealth lived openly here. Silk dresses brushed against cobblestones, polished boots echoed through narrow lanes, and the city spoke confidently of tradition, honor, and refinement. Yet beneath this carefully maintained image existed a truth so brutal that it shaped every brick, every fortune, every prayer spoken within its churches. Charleston was sustained by slavery, and at its core lay the slave market, a place where human lives were measured, priced, and discarded with terrifying efficiency. By 1850, Charleston had become the most important slave trading center in the United States. Even decades after the transatlantic slave trade was officially banned, the city thrived as a hub of the domestic slave trade. Enslaved people were shipped from the Upper South, Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, and sold southward to plantations hungry for labor. Men, women, and children passed through Charleston not as travelers but as cargo. Their names were replaced by ledgers. Their pasts were erased, but their futures were sold to the highest bidder. This system was not hidden from public view. It was normalized, regulated, and deeply woven into everyday life. Auctions were social events. Buyers discussed prices over coffee. Children watched as their parents bid on other human beings. The violence of slavery was softened by ritual, paperwork, and polite language. People were no longer people, they were prime field hands, strong young males, sound stock. Words became shields, protecting buyers from the moral weight of what they were doing. The slave market itself was a carefully designed space. Auction houses like Ryan's Mart were built to maximize profit and minimize sympathy. Enslaved people were held in narrow rooms behind iron gates, often for weeks at a time. They slept on hard floors, breathed stale air, and waited without knowing what awaited them. Traders controlled every aspect of their presentation. Men were shaved and scrubbed. Bruises were hidden. Wounds were explained away as accidents. Anyone who showed defiance was beaten until obedience could be displayed convincingly enough to satisfy buyers. On auction days, the courtyard filled early. Plantation owners from the countryside arrived in groups, already calculating profits. Professional traders watched closely, hoping to buy low and sell higher elsewhere. Wealthy households sent representatives to purchase servants. The mood was disturbingly calm. Laughter drifted through the air. Deals were whispered before bidding even began. For those attending, this was simply commerce. Male slaves were evaluated primarily for strength and endurance. Buyers inspected arms, backs, legs, and teeth. They asked about age, health, and past behavior. A young, strong man could command a high price, especially if he appeared compliant. Masculinity in the slave market was reduced to muscle and stamina, nothing more. Personality, intelligence, or dignity were seen as risks rather than assets. Yet occasionally, something disrupted this cold calculation. Very rarely, an enslaved man would stand out in a way that unsettled the market. Not because of rebellion or defiance, but because of presence, appearance, bearing. In a society that depended on the belief that enslaved people were inherently inferior, any contradiction to that belief caused unease. Charleston's white society lived in quiet fear of comparison. The system of slavery required strict boundaries, physical, social, psychological. Enslaved people were meant to appear broken, faceless, interchangeable. When one did not fit that mold, it created discomfort. An enslaved man who stood tall, who carried himself with composure, who possessed striking features, challenged the unspoken hierarchy that held everything together. Such men were dangerous, not because they carried weapons, but because they carried reminders of shared humanity. In 1850, this fear was intensified by the political climate. The nation was fracturing. The Compromise of 1850 had failed to ease tensions between North and South. The Fugitive Slave Act had inflamed anger and anxiety on both sides. Rumors of rebellion traveled quickly. Charleston responded with tighter controls. Enslaved people needed passes to move through the city. Night patrols increased. Education was forbidden. Gatherings were watched. Punishment was swift and public. Fear ruled everyone. Enslaved people feared violence and separation. Slaveholders feared revolt and loss of power. The market existed not only to sell labor, but to reinforce control. On one particular morning, the courtyard of a Charleston auction house filled as usual. Buyers gathered beneath the sun, fanning themselves, discussing crops and prices. The auctioneer prepared his ledger. Everything followed the familiar routine. Yet behind the closed doors, among the group of enslaved men waiting to be brought out, stood someone who had already drawn attention. He was young, perhaps in his early 20s. Taller than most. His posture was straight, not rigid with fear but controlled, deliberate. Weeks in captivity had not broken him in the way traders expected. His face bore no fresh scars. His features were unusually refined, enough to provoke lingering looks from the men who prepared him. They noticed it immediately, though none spoke of it openly. The traders debated how to handle him. Too much attention could raise suspicion. Too little could waste profit. They understood the unspoken rules of the market. An enslaved man who attracted too much notice could become a liability. Envy from other slaves. Obsession for buyers. Rumors that spread beyond control. Yet they also knew he would not pass unnoticed. Inside the holding area, the enslaved men stood silently. Some stared at the floor, others closed their eyes, rehearsing resignation. A few whispered prayers under their breath. They had learned not to ask questions, but questions led nowhere. Hope was dangerous. Silence was safer. The young man stood among them, still and watchful. His expression revealed little. Whatever his past had been, whatever life he had known before this place, had been stripped away. He was here now, reduced to a body waiting to be priced. Outside, the crowd grew impatient. But the bell was about to ring. The doors would soon open. Another auction would begin, another series of lives transferred by spoken numbers and raised hands. No one in the courtyard yet knew why this particular sale would be remembered. No one yet understood the whispers that would follow, the quiet conversations held behind closed doors, the discomfort that would linger long after the bidding ended. The system believed itself invincible. Charleston believed itself secure. The market believed it could reduce any human being to a transaction. It was wrong. Because sometimes, even in the most controlled spaces, something appeared that could not be fully contained. Something that reminded everyone present, if only for a moment, that what stood before them was not property, not inventory, not flesh for profit, but a man whose very existence challenged the lie on which the entire marketplace stood. And as the doors prepared to open, history held its breath, even if no one realized it yet. The doors opened slowly, not with drama, but with routine, and the men inside were brought forward one by one. Iron chains clinked softly as they stepped into the courtyard, blinking against the sudden light. The auctioneer's voice began its practiced rhythm, calling out ages, origins, and supposed virtues with the detached confidence of someone who had done this thousands of times before. Buyers leaned forward, eyes sharp, already calculating value. The first few men passed quickly. Strong backs, ordinary faces, familiar bodies that fit neatly into the expectations of the market. Bidding rose and fell without pause. Prices were agreed upon. Lives were reassigned. Then the young man stepped forward. The change in the courtyard was subtle but unmistakable. Conversations quieted. Fans slowed in midair. Several buyers straightened without realizing they had done so. It was not that he was dressed differently or presented with any special announcement. He wore the same simple clothing as the others, stood in the same place, followed the same instructions. Yet his presence altered the space around him. He stood tall, his shoulders squared not in defiance but in balance, as though standing upright was simply natural to him. His face was composed, calm, and striking in a way that resisted SWI description. His features were symmetrical, his skin unmarked by recent abuse, his eyes steady without appearing vacant. The auctioneer hesitated for half a second before speaking again. It was barely noticeable, but those who watched closely saw it. He cleared his throat and began his routine, announcing the young man's age, his health, his strength. He emphasized the expected qualities: able-bodied, suitable for field or house, no known history of escape. The words sounded rehearsed, but the crowd was no longer listening to the details. They were looking. Buyers circled closer. One man reached out and lifted the young man's chin, inspecting his face longer than necessary. Another examined his arms, then his posture, as if trying to understand something that did not fit into numbers. The young man did not resist, but he did not flinch. But he followed instructions with controlled precision. That composure unsettled some and intrigued others. Whispers began almost immediately. Quiet comments passed between men who had attended countless auctions and believed they had seen everything worth seeing. Some remarked on his appearance with thin smiles, but others frowned, uncomfortable with the attention he drew. A few glanced around, as though embarrassed by their own curiosity. The bidding started cautiously. The opening price was already high, higher than usual for a man of his listed age and background. A hand went up, then another. The price climbed steadily, faster than expected. But the auctioneer's voice grew more animated as he sensed the momentum. Buyers who had not planned to bid found themselves raising their hands almost involuntarily, drawn into a competition they did not fully understand. As the price rose, the mood shifted. What had begun as interest turned into rivalry. Pride entered the bidding. No one wanted to lose. Some wanted to win not because they needed labor, but because they could not tolerate the idea of another man owning him. Others felt a strange pull they would never name aloud. In a society obsessed with control, possession itself became the prize. The young man remained still as the numbers climbed. He did not look at the bidders. His gaze remained forward, his expression unreadable. If he felt fear, he did not show it. If he felt anger, it stayed buried. That restraint only deepened the unease. Enslaved men were expected to show something: fear, submission, tension. His calm suggested an inner life the market could not reach. When the hammer finally came down, the final price was unusually high. A murmur rippled through the courtyard. Some shook their heads. Others laughed quietly, disguising their discomfort as amusement. The buyer stepped forward to claim his purchase, his face flushed with triumph and something else harder to define. Papers were signed, but chains were adjusted. The transaction was complete. Yet even as the crowd dispersed, the whispers did not stop. People spoke of the young man that evening in parlors and taverns. They did not use his name because no one knew it or cared to ask. They referred to him by description instead: the handsome one, the Charleston prize, the one who fetched too much. Some speculated about his origins, but others questioned whether it was wise to own such a slave at all. A few joked crudely, attempting to strip the situation of its tension. None spoke openly about the deeper unease they felt. The buyer took possession of him immediately, not leaving him in the holding area overnight, as was sometimes done. He wanted him removed from public view as soon as possible. Attention was a double-edged thing. What raised value could also invite scrutiny, jealousy, or rumor. In Charleston, rumors were dangerous. They traveled quickly through both white and black communities, often growing sharper with each retelling. As the young man was led away, some noticed the way he walked, not dragged or hurried, but steady, controlled. It did not look like resignation, it did not look like defeat. That image lingered in the minds of those who had seen him, troubling their sleep in small, unspoken ways. BR within the enslaved community, news spread differently. Word passed quietly through glances and half-heard remarks. BR someone had been sold for an extraordinary price. Someone had drawn the attention of powerful men. BR such attention rarely ended well. Enslaved people understood the danger of being noticed. Beauty, intelligence, or dignity could provoke punishment just as easily as defiance. BR the young man was taken to a townhouse rather than a plantation, another detail that fueled speculation. House slaves lived under closer watch. BR their movements were restricted. Their behavior was scrutinized constantly. They were expected to reflect their owner's status while never threatening it. For a man who already unsettled people by simply standing still, this environment would be suffocating. BR. In the days that followed, servants in neighboring houses noticed him. He moved quietly, efficiently, performing tasks with care. He spoke only when spoken to. His voice, when heard, was calm and measured. That alone became a topic of conversation. Enslaved men were expected to be rough, loud, or broken. He was none of those things. Beyond the owner's household reacted with a mixture of pride and discomfort. Visitors commented on the new purchase with raised eyebrows and careful words. Compliments were offered, though rarely without an edge. Some praised the owner's discernment. Others warned him in subtle ways. A slave who attracted too much attention could invite trouble, from authorities, from neighbors, from the enslaved themselves. At night, the city returned to its routines. Gas lamps flickered. Patrols walked the streets. Enslaved people returned to quarters, carrying the weight of another day survived. Somewhere within Charleston's walls, the young man lay awake, listening to sounds he had not yet learned to interpret. His future had narrowed to the walls around him, yet something about him resisted complete erasure. Charleston believed it had absorbed him, catalogued him, and assigned him a place. The sale was complete. The ledger balanced. Business had been done, but the market had misjudged one thing: not everything that entered its walls could be reduced to a price. And as whispers continued to spread about his appearance, his composure, the strange discomfort he caused, something began to shift. Quietly, invisibly, the story moved beyond a single auction. What had been a transaction was becoming a question Charleston did not want to ask, but could not entirely silence. After the sale, life settled into a rhythm that appeared ordinary from the outside, yet nothing about the young man's existence was ordinary anymore. Within the household that now claimed ownership of him, every movement was watched, every silence interpreted. He was assigned work that kept him visible but controlled, tasks that required precision rather than brute strength, errands that carried him through hallways and courtyards where visitors could see him without ever speaking to him directly. His presence became a quiet display, one that the household both valued and feared. The other enslaved people noticed immediately. They had learned to read danger the way sailors read storms, and they understood that attention was rarely a blessing. They spoke to him cautiously at first, offering help in small, indirect ways. Some avoided him altogether, afraid that standing too close might draw notice. Jealousy mixed with concern, though it was rarely spoken aloud. Beauty in a place like Charleston was not protection, it was exposure. The white residents of the house reacted differently. The owner took pride in his purchase, though he never openly acknowledged the discomfort it caused him. Visitors commented on the young man's appearance with forced casualness. Compliments were delivered as jokes, warnings disguised as humor. A few men stared longer than etiquette allowed. A few women looked away too quickly. Each reaction reinforced the same truth: he disrupted expectations simply by existing. The young man himself remained measured. He learned quickly, adapting to the unspoken rules of the household. He kept his eyes lowered when required and raised them only when addressed. He spoke with restraint, choosing words carefully. That discipline, however, did not come from submission alone. there was an intelligence behind it, an awareness that made some uneasy. Intelligence in an enslaved man was considered a threat, something to be managed rather than encouraged. Rumors followed him beyond the house. In Charleston, stories traveled through kitchens, markets, taverns, and churches. People whispered about where he came from, about why he carried himself the way he did. Some claimed he had been raised differently, that he had lived in a household where he learned manners meant for free men. Others suggested darker possibilities, hinting at bloodlines that crossed boundaries no one wanted to name. Each rumor added another layer of danger. For the enslaved community, these whispers carried weight. They understood how quickly suspicion could turn into punishment. An enslaved man who seemed too proud or too refined could be accused of plotting rebellion or harboring forbidden knowledge. Patrols listened closely to gossip. Owners reacted preemptively. Fear did not need proof. The young man sensed the tightening net around him. He noticed how conversations stopped when he entered a room, how glances lingered and then slid away. He became careful not to draw attention, yet his very effort to remain unnoticed only highlighted the fact that he was already marked. There was no true invisibility for someone who had already been singled out. At night, when the city quieted and the gas lamps dimmed, Charleston's fears grew louder. Slave patrols increased their rounds. Whips cracked somewhere in the distance, reminders of the order that held the city together. In those moments, the young man lay awake, listening, thinking. Whatever hope he carried was guarded, buried deep where it could not be detected. The household's owner began to worry, not about kindness or morality, but about control. Attention had followed his purchase, and attention invited scrutiny. Other men asked questions he did not want to answer. Some hinted that owning such a slave could become a liability. The unspoken suggestion was clear. It might be safer to break him, to make him visibly submissive, to erase what made him stand out. Punishment did not come immediately. Instead, there were tests, small provocations designed to measure obedience. Orders delivered abruptly, tasks made deliberately difficult. Each time, the young man complied without complaint. He absorbed humiliation without visible reaction. That restraint frustrated those who expected either resistance or collapse. He gave them neither. This only deepened the unease. There was something about a man who could endure without visible damage that frightened those who depended on domination. Pain was meant to produce results: fear, obedience, gratitude for mercy. When it failed to leave marks on the spirit, it became less effective. Among the enslaved workers, opinions divided. Some admired him quietly, seeing in his composure a kind of resistance. Others feared him, believing his presence would bring trouble to everyone nearby. Both views were born from the same understanding. Survival depended on blending in, and he could not. Charleston itself seemed to react to him, as though the city sensed an imbalance. Patrols passed the house more often. Neighbors watched more closely. The atmosphere tightened, becoming heavier with suspicion. In a place built on hiera. Any disruption, however subtle, was treated as a threat. One evening, a visitor made a comment that shifted everything. It was spoken lightly, accompanied by laughter, but it landed with force. The visitor suggested that the young man looked like someone who should not be enslaved. The room went quiet. No one responded directly, but the idea had been spoken aloud, and that alone was dangerous. After that night, the owner's behavior changed. He became colder, more distant. The young man was given harsher tasks, less rest, fewer chances to be seen as anything other than labor. The message was clear: whatever made him stand out would be crushed. Yet even under increased pressure, something about him remained intact. His posture did not collapse. His gaze did not dull. He learned to endure without surrendering whatever core defined him. This quiet endurance became its own kind of rebellion, one that could not be easily punished because it left no evidence. The city continued its routines. Auctions came and went, ships docked. Fortunes were made, but beneath the surface, tension built. Charleston lived in constant fear of the people it enslaved. and that fear sharpened when confronted with someone who did not fit the narrative of inferiority. Br the young man became a symbol without intending to be one. To some, he represented danger, that to others, possibility, but to most, he was a problem they wished would disappear. In a society that relied on certainty, he introduced ambiguity, and ambiguity was intolerable. As weeks passed, it became clear that the market had underestimated the cost of his beauty. It had raised his price, but it had also marked him. Bar the same qualities that had drawn bids now drew scrutiny. The system that profited from him also sought to erase what made him visible. Something had to give. Either the young man would be broken, or the whispers would grow louder, or the city would act to remove the discomfort he caused. Charleston did not tolerate unanswered questions for long, and somewhere within that tightening circle of control, the young man understood a truth that few around him were willing to face. Survival would not come from obedience alone, but it would require something more careful, more dangerous, a choice that had not yet been made, but was drawing closer with every watchful glance and every rumor that refused to die. As the weeks turned into months, the whispers surrounding the young man deepened and changed in tone. What had begun as curiosity hardened into suspicion. Charleston was a city that survived on control, and anything it could not categorize made people uneasy. His beauty was no longer the central topic, it was the questions that followed it. People began to ask not just why he looked the way he did, but how he behaved the way he did. Where had he learned such restraint? But why did he speak so carefully? Why did he not display the broken manner expected of someone in his position? Boras, once unleashed, rarely moved in straight lines. They twisted as they passed from mouth to mouth, gaining sharp edges along the way. Some claimed he had been raised in a household where he was treated differently, taught manners meant for white servants rather than field hands. Others suggested he had belonged to a master who had educated him in secret. A few hinted that he had traveled, that he had seen places beyond Charleston and learned things he was not supposed to know. Each version carried its own danger, because knowledge itself was forbidden to the enslaved. More troubling rumors soon followed. Baba whispers lowered voices and closed doors. People speculated about his parentage, suggesting that his appearance was no accident. In Charleston, such suggestions were never made directly. They did not need to be, but everyone understood what was being implied. The possibility that his bloodline crossed boundaries threatened the carefully maintained illusion of racial purity. That illusion was essential to the moral defense of slavery. To question it was to weaken the entire structure. The owner heard these rumors long before they reached him openly. He noticed changes in how his peers spoke to him, how conversations paused when he entered a room. Invitations became less frequent. Jokes grew sharper, edged with warning. Owning the young man had become less a symbol of status and more a source of discomfort. The owner found himself defending a purchase he had once boasted about, insisting that the slave was nothing more than a fortunate acquisition, a coincidence of appearance and health, but doubt, once planted, was difficult to uproot. Inside the household, discipline tightened. The young man was watched more closely than before. Instructions were repeated, sometimes contradicted, as if his handlers hoped to catch him in a mistake. He was questioned about small things that should not have mattered, where he had learned a word, how he knew a particular task, why he completed something more efficiently than expected. Each question carried an accusation beneath it. He responded with the same calm he had always shown. He answered plainly, without elaboration. He did not volunteer information. He did not correct assumptions. Silence became his shield, though it came at a cost. Silence allowed others to fill the gaps with their own stories, and those stories grew darker by the day. Among the enslaved workers, fear spread quietly. They understood that rumors often preceded punishment, not just for the person at the center of them, but for anyone nearby. A slave suspected of being different could bring collective consequences. Some began to distance themselves from him, speaking less, standing farther away. Others offered quiet support, small acts of kindness that carried risk. A shared glance. A warning murmured while no one else listened. The young man absorbed it all. He had learned that. Truth mattered less than perception. In Charleston, perception ruled. It determined who was watched, who was punished, who disappeared. He knew that denying the rumors outright would not stop them. He also knew that confirming them, even accidentally, would be fatal. The city itself seemed to lean closer, listening. Charleston had long relied on informants, poor whites, free black residents, enslaved people forced to report on one another. Information was currency, and secrets rarely stayed buried. The more the young man tried to exist quietly, the more his presence seemed to draw attention. One evening, a patrol stopped him while he carried out an errand. His papers were examined longer than necessary. Questions were asked twice. The patrolman's eyes lingered on his face, their expressions unreadable. They let him pass, but the message was clear. He had been noticed by the mechanisms of control that governed the city. After that, restrictions increased. He was no longer allowed to leave the house alone. His movements were limited. Tasks that once took him through the city were reassigned. The owner justified these changes as caution, but the underlying motive was fear. Fear of gossip. Fear of scrutiny. Fear of what might happen if the rumors reached the wrong ears. Charleston had a long memory for perceived threats. Rebellions elsewhere had taught the city to react swiftly to anything unusual. A slave who appeared too intelligent, too confident, too composed could be labeled dangerous without ever lifting a hand. The punishment for danger did not require proof. The young man felt the walls closing in. Each day narrowed his world further, yet within that narrowing, his thoughts sharpened. He understood that the city did not need facts to destroy him. It needed only suspicion. Survival depended on navigating not just rules, but fears. The most dangerous rumors were the ones spoken with uncertainty rather than accusation. There's something about him, people said. I can't place it. Such statements invited imagination to do the work. In a society built on rigid categories, ambiguity was intolerable. The owner, desperate to regain control, considered selling him yet even that solution carried risk. Selling him would spread the story further. Buyers would ask why such a valuable slave was being released. The whispers would follow him to another household, perhaps growing louder. Charleston was not a large city. Stories move faster than people. Instead, the owner chose another path. He began to isolate him further, keeping him away from guests, minimizing his visibility. The young man was assigned tasks that kept him out of sight, work that demanded long hours and offered little interaction. It was an attempt to erase the problem without acknowledging it, but erasure proved difficult. Those who had seen him did not forget. The image lingered. The discomfort remained, but people spoke of him. Then, when he was no longer visible, as though the absence itself confirmed that something was being hidden. Within the enslaved community, the rumors took on a different meaning. Some saw in him a reminder of stolen possibilities. Others feared he would become an example, a lesson enforced through cruelty. They had seen it before. A slave disrupted the order simply by existing. The system responded harshly to restore balance. Man sensed that a breaking point was approaching. The city's patience was thinning. Control demanded resolution. Either the rumors would be proven false through visible submission, or they would be resolved through removal. Neither option promised safety. At night, as he lay awake, he listened to the sounds of Charleston breathing around him. The distant calls of patrols, the creak of wagons, the muffled conversations of other enslaved people sharing fears they could not speak aloud during the day. He thought of how fragile the line between survival and destruction truly was. Charleston prided itself on order, but beneath that order lay constant anxiety. The enslaved population outnumbered the white population. The city knew this, and it governed accordingly. Any sign of unpredictability was treated as a threat to be extinguished. The young man had become unpredictable simply by refusing to collapse into the role assigned to him. His beauty had drawn attention. His composure had sustained it. Now the whispers had transformed him into something dangerous in the collective imagination. He did not know what would come next, only that the city would not allow uncertainty to linger indefinitely. Charleston always resolved its fears one way or another, and as the rumors thickened, tightening like a noose made of words, the young man understood that whatever secret others believed he carried, it had already begun to shape his fate. By the time the rumors hardened into quiet consensus, the young man's fate was no longer entirely in his own hands. Charleston had decided that he was a problem, and the city had many ways of solving problems without ever admitting they existed. The owner felt the pressure most acutely. Invitations dwindled, but conversations stalled when he entered a room. Men who once praised his judgment now spoke to him with thin smiles and cautionary tones. They did not accuse him of anything outright, they did not need to. The message was unmistakable. Whatever curiosity his purchase had stirred had curdled into concern. The owner began to measure risk the way traders measured profit. He watched his household with a new sharpness, listening for loose tongues, counting how often the young man's name surfaced in conversations. He weighed the cost of keeping him against the cost of letting him go. Neither option promised relief. To sell him would spread the story further, sending it outward like ripples from a stone dropped in water. To keep him invited scrutiny, and the uncomfortable suggestion that the owner either could not control his property or, worse, did not wish to. The city's mechanisms moved quietly. There was no formal accusation, no official inquiry. Instead, questions arrived as casual remarks. Had the owner noticed anything unusual? Was the slave compliant? Had there been any trouble? Such questions were never neutral. They carried the implication that trouble was expected, and expectation itself could summon consequences. Within the household, the rules tightened again. The young man was given longer hours, fewer privileges, and harsher supervision. The goal was not merely to work him harder, but to reshape him, to grind down whatever had made him stand out. Fatigue was a tool, humiliation was another. Yet even as his body grew thinner and his days more punishing, something in him remained untouched. He obeyed. He endured. He did not break. But this endurance, instead of reassuring those around him, unsettled them further. Pain was meant to leave marks. When it failed to do so visibly, it suggested a strength that could not be measured or owned. The owner began to fear not rebellion but influence. He imagined whispers among the enslaved, glances exchanged, the silent elevation of one man into a symbol. Symbols were dangerous, but inspired thought. Thought led to action. The enslaved community sensed the shift. They had learned to read the signs that preceded disaster. Increased supervision. Sudden restrictions. A tightening of the household's atmosphere. They understood that the young man had become a focal point, and that focus could draw fire in unpredictable ways. Some withdrew from him entirely, prioritizing their own survival. Others lingered nearby, offering what little solidarity they could. In such moments, solidarity was often wordless, a shared look, a warning whispered when no one else could hear. The young man accepted both distance and kindness without comment. He did not resent those who stepped away. Fear was a language he understood. He carried his own fear carefully, never allowing it to show. He knew that fear, when visible, invited exploitation. Charleston's nights grew more restless. Patrols passed more frequently. The sound of boots on stone echoed longer. The city was tense, and tension always sought an outlet. Somewhere, someone would be made an example of. The question was only who. The owner reached a decision under the guise of pragmatism. He would remove the young man from public view entirely. Not through sale, but through reassignment. There were plantations inland, places where attention was scarce and control was absolute. A man could disappear there without ever leaving the state. No whispers followed into the fields. No curious glances lingered in drawing rooms. Labor replaced spectacle. The order was delivered without ceremony. The young man was told he would be transferred temporarily, his skills needed elsewhere. The word temporary meant little. In Charleston, temporary arrangements often became permanent through neglect, but he listened, nodded, and asked no questions. Questions changed nothing. On the morning of his departure, the city looked unchanged. The harbor glinted in the sun, carriages rolled past, life continued with its usual confidence. But to the outside world, nothing of consequence was happening. One enslaved man being moved from one place to another was an unremarkable event. Yet for those who understood the language of disappearance, it marked a turning point. He was taken inland under guard, the city receding behind him with every mile. The plantation he arrived at was vast, its fields stretching outward in neat, oppressive lines. Here, beauty held no value. Strength did, endurance did, individuality did not. The overseer's gaze stripped him of whatever had distinguished him before. He was assigned to hard labor, sun up to sundown, with little rest and less mercy. The work was designed to exhaust thought. Repetition dulled the mind, but pain focused attention on survival. But for many, this was enough. It broke them down into parts that could be managed. The young man felt the strain immediately. His body protested. His hands blistered and bled. His muscles burned with a constant ache. Yet even here something in him resisted erasure. He learned the rhythms of the work, conserved energy where he could, endured without complaint. The overseer noticed. He always noticed. Efficiency without obedience was suspicious. The young man did not draw attention to himself intentionally, but efficiency was a form of attention all the same. It suggested capability. Capability suggested agency. Agency was not permitted. Punishments followed minor infractions. A moment too slow. A glance held too long. The lash fell not out of rage, but out of calculation. Pain was meant to remind him of his place. He absorbed it with the same controlled silence that had unsettled Charleston. Among the other enslaved workers, this silence became legend, but some admired it, others feared it. Both reactions increased his isolation. At night, the quarters buzzed with exhausted murmurs. Stories were traded like currency. People spoke of Charleston as though it were another world, distant and unreal. The young man listened more than he spoke, but he learned what had happened to others who had drawn attention. Men who had vanished after being labeled troublesome, but women who had been sold south and never heard from again. The system had many ways of resolving discomfort. He understood now that his removal from the city was not a solution but a postponement. The same qualities that had unsettled Charleston unsettled the plantation in subtler ways, but control required certainty. He embodied uncertainty. Weeks passed, then months. The owner heard reports from the overseer that the young man worked well enough. No open trouble. This should have been reassuring, but it was not. The owner could not shake the sense that the problem had not been solved, only relocated. He wondered whether he should have sold him after all, passed the risk to someone else. Regret mixed with relief. At least the city was no longer watching him so closely, but Charleston had not forgotten. Stories have a way of surviving attempts at burial. A sailor mentioned the handsome slave once sold for an extraordinary price. A trader laughed about it over drinks. A visiting planter asked after him casually. Each mention kept the story alive, thin but persistent. The young man, far from the city, felt the distance but not the safety. The plantation was a place of relentless sameness, yet beneath that sameness ran undercurrents of desperation and quiet resistance. People plotted small acts of defiance, working slower, feigning illness, stealing moments of rest. Survival took many forms. For the young man, survival meant patience. He did not know whether escape was possible or whether it would be worth the cost. He did not know if the city would ever release its hold on him. He knew only that the system that had elevated him as a curiosity now sought to erase him as a threat. What neither Charleston nor the plantation understood was that erasure was never complete. Even when stripped of visibility, a person carried themselves forward. Br memory persisted. Composure endured. And in a world built on the lie that some lives were meant to be owned, even quiet endurance could become dangerous. The city believed it had solved its problem. The plantation believed it had absorbed him. Both were wrong. The forces set in motion by that single auction had not reached their conclusion. They'd only changed shape, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer be enough to contain what had been awakened. The plantation was meant to erase him. That was its purpose, though no one ever said it aloud. It was designed to grind men down until they became indistinguishable from one another, bodies moving in rhythm with the land, thoughts narrowed to the space between sunrise and exhaustion. Charleston had sent him there to disappear, and for a time it seemed to work. Bar days blurred into one another. Bar seasons shifted. The memory of the city softened at the edges, like something dreamed rather than lived. Yet erasure was never complete. From the beginning, the young man understood that the plantation demanded a different kind of survival. In the city, attention had been his danger. Here, it was endurance. The overseer valued output above all else, and violence was applied with precision rather than emotion. A man who slowed the line was punished. A man who stood out was punished. A man who endured punishment too well was punished again, simply to test the limits of his endurance. The young man learned quickly. He measured his strength carefully, never giving. All of it at once. He worked hard enough to avoid suspicion, but not so hard that he inspired expectation. He learned when to bend and when to stiffen, when to lower his eyes, and when to let them remain neutral. Survival became a calculation made hour by hour. The other enslaved workers watched him from a distance at first. New arrivals were always observed cautiously. Trust was dangerous, and curiosity could cost lives. But over time, patterns emerged. But they saw that he did not complain. They saw that he did not boast. They saw that when punished, he absorbed it without spectacle. That kind of restraint earned a quiet respect. At night in the quarters, words were exchanged sparingly. Stories were told in fragments, careful not to reveal too much. The young man listened more than he spoke, but he listened deeply. He learned who had been sold away, who had died, who had run and never returned. He learned the unspoken rules of the place, the lines that could not be crossed, and the small spaces where humanity still survived. There were moments when the mask slipped, though only briefly. A glance held too long. A question answered with unexpected clarity. A gesture of kindness offered without calculation. These moments did not go unnoticed. Among the enslaved, they sparked something close to hope, though no one named it as such. Hope was dangerous, but it invited disappointment. The overseer noticed too. He always noticed. The young man's ability to endure without visible damage irritated him. Pain was meant to teach. When it failed to leave the expected marks on the spirit, it challenged the logic of punishment itself. The overseer escalated, not out of cruelty alone, but out of a need to reassert control. Whippings became more frequent. Ed remained attached to that sale. Biana began to fear that removing the young man from the city had not reduced the risk, only delayed it. A slave who survived too well under pressure became dangerous in a different way. He began to consider more permanent solutions, ones that left no room for return. On the plantation, the young man sensed a change. The overseer's attention sharpened. The punishments became less reactive and more deliberate. There was talk of moving workers again, of breaking up groups that had grown too familiar. Disruption was a tool used to prevent solidarity. One night, after a particularly brutal day, an older man in the quarters spoke to him quietly. The words were few, chosen with care. He warned him that men like him did not last long in places like this, not because they rebelled, but because they reminded others of what had been taken from them. Such reminders invited consequences. The young man understood. He had understood for a long time. The plantation was not an end point. It was a narrowing corridor. He could feel the walls closing in, not dramatically, but steadily. He began to think not in terms of comfort or endurance, but in terms of time. Bar escape was a thought he had avoided until now. It was a dangerous thought, one that had destroyed many before him. Bar the odds were brutal, bar the land was unforgiving, the consequences of failure were absolute. BR yet remaining carried its own certainty. If he stayed, the system would eventually find a way to erase him completely. BR he began to observe more closely. Bar routes, patrol patterns, barred the habits of the overseer, the moments when attention drifted. Bar he did not share these observations. Knowledge was power, and power was safest when held alone. There were others who sensed something changing in him. A quiet urgency, BR, a focus that went beyond daily survival. Some offered help indirectly. BR, a piece of information, a warning about a patrol. BR, a shared silence that said more than words could. Others distanced themselves, afraid of being drawn into whatever was coming. BR, the plantation moved through another season. Heat gave way to rain, crops were harvested and replanted. BR life continued its punishing cycle. Yet beneath the surface, something shifted. But the young man no longer thought only of endurance. He thought of movement. The overseer's patience thinned. But one afternoon, after a minor infraction that would not normally have drawn notice, punishment was administered publicly and excessively. It was meant as a message, not just to him, but to everyone watching. This is what happens when you stand out. This is how uncertainty is resolved. The young man took the blows without sound. Blood ran. The crowd watched in silence. Something passed between them, something unspoken but heavy. The overseer felt it too. For a brief moment, he wondered whether he had miscalculated. That doubt hardened into anger almost immediately. That night, the quarters were quieter than usual. BR, no stories, BR, no murmurs. Only the sound of breathing and the distant insects. The young man lay awake, pain radiating through his body, thoughts sharp and clear. He understood that the message had been delivered. The system had chosen escalation. BR in Charleston, the owner received another report. This one was less cautious. The overseer expressed concern that the slave's presence was becoming destabilizing. He suggested that removal, permanent removal, might be the safest course. The owner read the words slowly. Permanent removal could mean many things. BR sail farther south. BR transfer to harsher conditions. Or something final. The owner did not reply immediately. He sat with the decision longer than he cared to admit. There was a part of him buried deep that recognized something in the young man he could not name without threatening his own sense of order. That recognition frightened him more than any rumor ever had. Back on the plantation, the young man felt time compressing. Every day carried more weight than the last. He moved carefully, conserving strength, watching for signs. He did not know exactly when he would act, only that the moment would come suddenly. Opportunities rarely announced themselves. When it came, it was not dramatic, but it was a small failure in routine. A guard distracted. A path briefly unwatched. A storm that masked sound and movement. The young man did not hesitate. Hesitation was a luxury he could not afford. What followed was chaos measured in heartbeats. Pain flared as he pushed his body beyond what it should have been able to do. Fear sharpened his senses rather than dulling them. He moved not with desperation, but with focus. Every step carried the knowledge that there could be no return. Behind him, the plantation continued its routines for a few precious moments, unaware that something had broken free. When the alarm finally rose, it was loud and furious, echoing across the fields. Dogs were readied, men armed themselves. The hunt began with practiced efficiency. The young man ran not toward freedom as an abstract idea, but toward uncertainty. Uncertainty was preferable to certainty. The land swallowed him quickly, trees and darkness closing in. Each breath burned, each sound could be the one that ended everything. Whether he would survive the night, he did not know. Whether Charleston would ever release its hold on him, he could not say. But as he moved through the dark, chased by a system that had tried and failed to define him, one truth remained clear. B. He was no longer waiting to be erased. BR. And whatever happened next, the story that began in a Charleston auction yard had reached a point where silence would no longer be enough to contain it. The night was thick with humidity, and the darkness pressed close, wrapping the young man in its weight as he ran. Every sound was amplified, the crack of a twig under foot, the flutter of a bird startled from its perch, the distant bark of a dog. He moved with a precision born from months of observation, avoiding the open paths and known patrol routes. His mind was sharp, cataloguing every landmark, every subtle change in the terrain. Survival demanded more than speed. It demanded calculation, awareness, and the quiet discipline that had allowed him to endure so long under observation. BR behind him, the plantation erupted in noise. BR guards shouted. Lanterns swung through the night, casting long, jittering shadows across fields and fences. Dogs barked, their sharp teeth snapping at the edge of vision. The overseer's voice carried above the others, precise and furious, directing men to strategic points. Each second pressed against him, yet he did not falter. Bar fear did not freeze him. It focused him. The route he had memorized in fragments over weeks of close observation now became his lifeline. A fallen tree created a natural bridge over a narrow creek. He paused just long enough to ensure its stability, then crossed, keeping low. Water splashed over his boots, soaking him instantly, but he did not hesitate. Bar, cold and wet, were preferable to capture. He knew the forest could hide him in ways the open plantation could not, but every instinct honed through years of oppression now guided him. When he reached a familiar clearing, he slowed briefly to listen. The sounds of pursuit were faint but present. Men and dogs were organized, searching systematically. The young man adjusted his course, doubling back along a hidden deer trail that he had noticed once while gathering firewood. Such knowledge, once irrelevant to survival, was now essential. The forest became an ally in ways the plantation never could have been. Hours passed like minutes. He moved with a quiet urgency, avoiding light, shadow, and any movement that could betray him. Fatigue threatened to slow him, but he ignored it, focusing instead on the rhythm of his breathing, the texture of the earth beneath his boots, the subtle shifts in the wind. Every detail mattered. One mistake could cost him freedom or life. At some point, he reached a creek larger than the ones he had crossed earlier. Its waters were dark and moving swiftly. He paused, listening to the chorus of insects and the faint murmur of distant pursuit. Crossing meant exposure, but staying meant delay. He stripped down to reduce drag and entered the water, letting the current push him downstream while keeping his head low. Each movement was deliberate. The water cut at his legs and arms, chilling him, but he welcomed it. Pain sharpened the senses. It was proof that he was still alive, still in control. By dawn, the plantation was in chaos. The guards' shouts had turned frantic. The lanterns swung uselessly in the pale light of approaching day. The dogs, exhausted, lagged behind. Our men called out to each other, searching systematically but failing to find him. The Bartho. Young man had disappeared into the forest. For the first time in months, he was beyond immediate reach. The plantation, that carefully controlled environment, could not contain him anymore. Yet freedom, even partial, carried its own peril. He could not remain in one place. Patrols would expand, horses would track, and news of his flight would reach neighboring plantations quickly. He understood the geography of the surrounding area well enough to avoid major roads, to slip between farms unnoticed, and to rely on hidden watercourses and wooded paths. Every choice mattered. One misstep would be fatal. He survived the day hidden in shadows, moving only when necessary. Food and water were scarce. Hunger gnawed and thirst cut through him like fire, but he refused to slow down. Survival demanded discomfort. Comfort was a trap. Every hour, every mile, pushed him closer to a freedom that existed as possibility rather than guarantee. At nightfall, he encountered a small group of people moving quietly in the forest. They were neither threatening nor welcoming, just shadows like himself. After careful observation, he realized they were other enslaved people who had escaped from nearby plantations. men and women who had learned similar lessons about patience, concealment, and survival. Without speaking more than necessary, he joined their movement, their paths merging in silent understanding. Safety, even temporary, was found in numbers, though caution remained absolute. As they traveled together, he learned what each person carried: stories of cruelty, of narrow escapes, of lost family members, of brutality witnessed and endured. They shared no false hope, no promises of comfort. Every word was weighed against risk. The young man listened and absorbed, finding patterns in their knowledge, combining it with what he had learned at the plantation and in Charleston. Each fragment of information was another tool in the arsenal of survival. Days turned into weeks. The young man adapted to this new, precarious existence. He learned to navigate the land with precision. Streams became guides, hills and ridges became markers, but hidden paths and animal tracks were lifelines. Every decision, when to move, when to hide, when to drink, when to sleep, was a calculation. The forest, once indifferent, now became a terrain he could manipulate, a partner in his flight. Meanwhile, Charleston had not forgotten him. Word of his escape spread quickly through letters, travelers, and gossip. The story of the handsome male slave who had fetched an extraordinary price and vanished under mysterious circumstances became a whispered cautionary tale. Traders and planters debated what might have become of him. Some mocked the idea of survival, others whispered with unease about the audacity required to escape, especially one who had been sold as a prize. Back on the plantation, the owner was furious. Loss of property was one thing, but loss under circumstances that humiliated the system was intolerable. Punishment was meted out to those still under his control, both to reinforce authority and to discourage further flight. Yet the young man's absence could not be undone. For the first time, he existed entirely outside the structures that had sought to contain him. In the forest, the young man considered the future. Absolute freedom was impossible. Society's systems stretched far and wide. Yet relative freedom, moving unseen, making choices that no overseer could dictate, was within reach. Every day he survived without being captured. Every mile he traveled without detection was a victory in itself. Through forests and rivers he pressed onward. Hunger remained, but his resolve strengthened. Fear persisted, but it was a sharpened focus rather than paralyzing terror. Every step reinforced the understanding that he was no longer defined by Charleston, by the plantation, by the expectations of those who had purchased him. He was defined only by his choices, by his ability to endure, adapt, and survive. Other runaways joined occasionally, and he shared what knowledge he could: paths, hidden shelters, safe water. Survival was communal, yet always cautious. But trust was measured, because betrayal could be fatal. He learned the rhythm of the terrain, the timing of patrols, the subtle signs that indicated safety or danger. Every day was a test, and he passed it through discipline and observation. In time, the young man came to understand the true nature of his flight. It was not merely escape from chains, it was escape from the expectations, from the constant surveillance, from the assumption that he could be owned or measured by others. Each decision, each calculated risk, reaffirmed his agency. In a world designed to deny him power, he reclaimed it step by step. Charleston and the plantation still existed, still spread their rules and fears, still told stories to maintain control. Yet somewhere beyond their reach, the young man moved, a figure of quiet defiance. The hands that had been bought and sold now acted only for themselves. The body that had been a curiosity and a prize was no longer confined. And though the future was uncertain, the young man understood one enduring truth. The system could try to erase him, punish him, or relocate him, but it could never truly contain him. His existence, his choice, and his movement had become a statement the city could neither suppress nor ignore. The forest stretched endlessly before him, dark and unyielding, but it was a freedom of its own making. By now, the young man had learned to move without leaving trace, to blend into shadows, to listen to the land and read its subtle signs. Every rustle of leaves, every broken twig, every faint ripple of water became part of a map that existed entirely in his mind. Survival demanded constant vigilance, but with it came a measure of power he had never known while under chains. The forest was no longer merely a refuge. It was a place where he could exist on his own terms, where the rules imposed by Charleston and the plantations could not reach him. Months passed, each day a test of endurance, resourcefulness, and patience. Hunger was a constant companion, as were the aches and bruises that came from relentless movement. Yet each hardship reinforced the young man's resilience. He had learned to ration his energy carefully, to hunt and forage when possible, to conceal his presence from anyone who might be searching. Every success, no matter how small, was a quiet victory. With each step he affirmed that he was no longer the property of anyone, no longer a commodity to be displayed, measured, and sold. Along the way, he encountered others who had slipped from the control of the slave system. Some had been running for years, others were more recent escapees, but each brought stories, lessons, and warnings. From them, he learned the importance of alliances, even if temporary, and the necessity of caution. Trust was fragile, and betrayal could be fatal. Yet human connection, even fleeting, offered strength. They shared knowledge about patrol patterns, hidden shelters, and the subtle signals that warned of danger. Through these shared experiences, the young man expanded his understanding of freedom, not as an abstract concept, but as a practice of constant vigilance, adaptation, and awareness. Despite this progress, Charleston's shadow loomed. News traveled slowly, but the story of his disappearance had already reached planters, traders, and patrols far beyond the city limits. The narrative of the handsome male slave sold for an extraordinary price who had vanished from control became both legend and cautionary tale. It spread across the region, whispered in taverns, kitchens, and market squares. Some doubted it, others were unsettled by the audacity, but all recognized that such an escape was remarkable and, in a society obsessed with order threatening in the quiet hours, the young man reflected on how far he had come, not merely in distance but in autonomy. He had survived situations that would have crushed most, endured violence and degradation that sought to reduce him to nothing, and emerged with his mind and spirit intact. Every step away from the plantations, every night spent hidden, reinforced a growing sense of self-possession that could not be taken by chains, threats, or fear. But the land was both a barrier and a guide. Rivers that could drown were also avenues for concealment. Dense thickets provided cover, yet slowed movement and exposed him to physical strain. He learned to weigh risks continuously, to accept discomfort as a necessary companion, and to value patience as much as speed. Every decision required attention to detail. Every error could be fatal. Freedom was not a single act, it was a series of calculated choices, each dependent on observation, instinct, and courage. Winter approached, bringing its own challenges. Cold winds bit through thin clothing, and frozen streams demanded caution. Yet even in harsh weather the young man adapted. He found shelter in caves, hollowed trees, and the remnants of abandoned structures. He learned to make fires without smoke drawing attention, to identify edible roots and plants when game was scarce, and to remain alert to the presence of humans who might see him as prey or property. Each adaptation strengthened his resilience, proving to himself that survival was possible even under relentless adversity. Over time, his body grew leaner, stronger, honed by constant movement and labor. Fatigue became a familiar companion, yet it did not dictate his choices. His mind remained sharp, continually analyzing his surroundings, planning his next movements, and assessing potential threats. He had become not only a survivor, but a strategist, one whose understanding of the land and the behaviors of those pursuing him gave him a remarkable advantage. Encounters with other escapees taught him more than survival. They taught him about solidarity, about the unspoken ways that people in flight could support one another without exposing themselves to risk. He learned to communicate in subtle signals, to leave markers only those who knew could read, and to recognize patterns that indicated safety or danger. Every alliance was temporary, contingent on circumstance, yet each one reinforced the notion that freedom, though solitary in its ultimate form, could be strengthened through careful collaboration. As months turned into years, the young man's story became increasingly difficult for Charleston to contain. Traders and planters speculated about his fate, some assuming he had perished, others fearing he had integrated into free communities where his knowledge and presence could inspire resistance. The narrative of the handsome male slave who had vanished continued to ripple outward, a quiet embarrassment to the institutions that had sought to own him. Even as time passed, the impossibility of his survival in the face of relentless pursuit became part of local legend, a story that haunted those who had once sought to control him. Within himself, he reflected on what he had become. No longer merely a commodity, no longer a captive, he was a man defined by choice, action, and endurance. The lessons of Charleston, the plantation, and the forest had forged an understanding of freedom as both practice and principle. It was not granted it was claimed, nurtured, and defended through continuous effort. And while the path ahead remained uncertain, the young man had proven that systems designed to dominate and erase could be resisted, even in subtle, quiet, and persistent ways. By the time he reached distant lands beyond the immediate reach of Charleston's influence, he carried not just the memory of chains, but the knowledge of their limits. The city that had purchased him, the PLA, Entation that had sought to break him, and the society that had sought to define him could no longer dictate his existence. He had transcended the expectations imposed upon him, transforming survival into autonomy and endurance into freedom. In the quiet of the forest, along hidden paths, and in the deliberate choices that shaped each day, the young man discovered an unassailable truth. He was no longer property, rumor, or curiosity. He was fully, irreversibly himself, and so his story, which began in the auction yard of Charleston, concluded not with chains, nor with submission, nor with erasure, but with a life claimed entirely on his own terms. The handsome male slave, once sold for an extraordinary price, became a symbol of resilience and self-determination, a living reminder that even in the darkest corners of oppression, the human spirit can endure, adapt, and ultimately prevail. Though the world that had sought to own him remained intact, he had moved beyond it. He had become impossible to contain, impossible to erase, and impossible to forget. His freedom, hard-won and fiercely guarded, was the final answer to the question Charleston had never been able to resolve, that no system, however brutal, could fully suppress what it could not possess, the essence of a determined, living human being.